So I am thrilled today to have Aline Sierp as our guest speaker. And she's an assistant professor in European Studies at Maastricht University. Her research interests cover collective memory, questions of identity, and European integration. And very interestingly, before joining University of Maastricht, she worked as a researcher at the Dachau concentration camp memorial site. She has written extensively on all of these topics of great interest to our collective today. She's the author of History, Memory, and Trans-European Identity, Unifying Divisions, and she's the co-editor of Dividing United Europe, From Crisis to Fragmentation, and of Agency and Transnational Memory Politics. She's also the co-founder and co-president of the Memory Studies Association and the Council of European Studies Research Network on Transnational Memory and Identity in Europe. So she's an institution builder and a colleague to know. So again, Aline, I'm really excited to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for this invitation. I wish I could say I'm very thrilled to be in Montreal. Unfortunately, I'm not. I would have loved to visit you in your beautiful city. I had the pleasure a few years ago and would have been nice to come back.
Another time, I hope.
Yeah. The advantage of this, of course, is that we can all sit in our living rooms quite comfortably. I have to apologize in case you hear my 18-month-old son in the background, because we are in full lockdown. No, daycares are closed, so he's at home. So I hope he's not going to disturb too much the talk. I'm going to share my screen so you can follow my PowerPoint presentation. So I hope you can see this. The talk I'm going to give today is based on an article that I published not so long ago in Interventions, the International Journal of Post-Colonial Studies. I know that some in the audience read it, others didn't, which means that I'll try to be as concise but also explicit as possible. If there's something that is not clear or where I should explain more, then just write down your questions and then I'm happy to answer later. Now, the topic of EU memory politics and its colonial past is quite a hot topic. I only have to remind you of the movement last summer about Black Lives Matter, the controversies when it came to statues, controversial statues, especially of the colonial past, but then also the accusations that were flying around politically during the migration crisis in Europe, where politicians were accusing each other basically of not having paid enough attention to the legacy of colonialism and therefore causing some of the inflow of migrants into Europe. So basically, these are all accusations, debates, discussions, public issues that are connected with the legacy of colonialism. And therefore, I found it quite surprising when I realized and started research into this, into the memory of colonialism, that there's a bit of a gap in research, at least when you look at the transnational European level. Most research concentrates on local questions or on the national way of dealing with this memories, but there's very little research on the European Union level, for example. And it was really a quote that made me think more about this and made me delve into the subject, which is, and I put it up on the slide here, colonialism is silently inscribed in the genes of the European integration project since its origins. Now on the map, you can see that most European member states were still colonial powers when the European Economic Community, which then turned into the European Union, was founded in 1957. And some of them still had colonial possessions when they joined years later, for example, Portugal. But while European efforts for transnational historical remembrance have focused almost exclusively on the Holocaust and National Socialism, as well as Stalinism more recently, the European Union remains quiet about the memories of imperialism and colonialism. And this is quite surprising, if you consider that in other contexts, the EU has been much less hesitant to address its dark past. One could actually argue that it has built its raison d'etre around the whole experience of oppression and a coercion that many European citizens suffered during and after World War II. Now, the question I ask myself, and this is really the guiding question of this presentation today, is how can we explain this? How can we explain this very ambivalent, selective relationship towards Europe's weight of history, as Van Rompuy once called it? Where does the memory of colonialism emerge, and where is it silenced, and which actors are involved in this process? So first, we need to know something about European integration and colonialism, generally speaking. And I think it is fair to say that colonialism, the process of decolonization, and European integration cannot be detangled. For the very early thinkers of European integration, the concept of Eurafrique or Pan-Europa, so a region that included Europe, Africa, and some areas of the Middle East. And here on the slide, you can see the famous map by Coudenhove-Kalergi depicting his vision of Pan-Europa. So this idea really was part of the logical continuation of the contemporary political situation in the interwar period. And indeed, the proposal in 1950 by French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman to pool the French and German coal and steel production, and thus, of course, the output of two industries that are necessary to make war. This proposal, on the one hand, aimed at ensuring future peaceful relations between European countries, and on the other, raising living standards after the devastation of World War II. The latter was very closely connected to a third objective that nowadays is often forgotten when we talk about the Schuman Declaration. And I'm sure that if I say that, you've probably never heard about it before. If you look on the Schuman Declaration, also like online, for example, and many of the copies that you find, this third objective is actually omitted, which is the development of the African continent, which was at the time described as one of its, so the community's essential tasks. So this third objective is something that sounds odd to us maybe nowadays, but it was really one of the three objectives that were mentioned by Schuman. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and to a certain extent also Italy were still colonial powers when the Rome Treaties were signed in 1957, and they managed to include their colonial possessions as associated to the newly formed European Economic Community. So most activities of the early years of integration were confined to development cooperation and the strengthening of economic ties. And they were very national in character. It took until the 1980s before policies moved away from unconditionality of aid towards making it dependent also on some sort of political cooperation. Now, while real progress was made on Europeanizing policies that were aimed at tying the former colonies closely to the EU's member states, a similar development regarding the atonement for the crimes committed in those countries during the colonization period could not be observed. If you search through the Eurolex depository, which is the main depository really of EU documentation, resolutions, speeches, etc., then you see not much more than just lofty statements. What you can find are words like environmental colonialism, agricultural colonialism, especially in the context of the EU's development policies. There's a lot of talk about the neo-colonialist attitude of the EU that is mentioned in references to its neighborhood policy or the accession negotiations with potential future member states. But then also in the recent Brexit debates, there was quite a little bit of talk about the colonial legacy, etc. And there's many commentators who said that the move of the UK away from Europe has its root in the imperialism that Great Britain was performing for decades before. So in short, the term colonialism is clearly used, and in some cases in one breath with Nazism and fascism, as a negative reference point for other policies. As a result, recollections of the colonial period are redirected and moved to an abstract level. And this allows for the blending out of certain aspects, among them, of course, the human rights violations that took place in the name of the colonizers. Now, how does that fit together with European memory politics? I could say a lot about this, of course, this is part of my main research, really. But I think for this talk, we should really concentrate on this as a framework. And it's important to know that the EU has become very active in memory politics since the 1990s. Because it was using the rearm of memory as a mechanism for public sphere formation. However, if you look at them, you can see very quickly that they're very selective and they're very inward looking. So initially, they focused mainly on the Holocaust and World War II, especially in their role as negative founding myths. And this really continued until 2004, when 10 Central and Eastern European states joined. And they quickly challenged this very unitary Western European narrative as soon as they entered the European Union. And this is, of course, because for many of these so-called new member states, the end of World War II had not meant liberation from dictatorship, but really the beginning of a new period of repression. And they wanted to have recognition for the history of suffering. I could give a whole lecture only on that. But I think, again, what is important here is to know that there was this memory competition for a very long time between East and West. Now, the memory of colonialism, or any other kind of memory, has not played a big role in it. It really focused mainly on these two: Holocaust, National Socialism, and then the experience of Stalinism after World War II. And it might have been precisely this very limited focus on the European totalitarianism and the thesis of the singularity of the murder of the Jews that has narrowed the overall perspective. I would actually argue that the fact that the non-affirmative comparison between the Shoah and colonial genocide is a taboo, which is ultimately what underpins a hierarchy of victims, which assumes in its worst form racial stereotypes. Historians have concentrated on European wars and European problems, so on fascism, on National Socialism, on Mussolini, Hitler, and Stalin. And the EU has followed this pattern by concentrating its remembrance efforts for decades almost exclusively on the experience of Nazism, fascism, National Socialism, and Stalinism. Not even the experiences of some of the Southern European countries, Francoism, for example, or the civil war in Greece, has a lot of traction. It doesn't have a lot of there's not much talk about this. It's being included kind of in the idea of totalitarianisms, but the real focus has been on Nazism, fascism, and Stalinism, really. Now, one of the most recent examples of this is the House of European History, which is a museum in Brussels, a very contested museum for different reasons. The picture that you see on the slide here is from its permanent exhibition, where they basically put in one spot the history and memory of National Socialism and Stalinism, and they're being heavily criticized for that. Regardless of what they decided to do when it comes to these totalitarian regimes, they have not dedicated a lot of space to the history of colonialism. And if you talk to the director, Dr. Itzel, she actually admits herself that the history and memory of colonialism does not receive sufficient attention in a museum, and that much more space has been given, for example, to the Holocaust. Now, even if the memory of colonialism does not feature prominently neither in political speeches nor in any exhibitions on Europe, this does not mean that European politicians are completely oblivious to the very evident gap in the remembrance landscape. Indeed, since the beginning of the 2000s, the European Parliament issued repeatedly calls to the European Commission to make funding available for research relating to the history of slavery and colonialism. It's interesting that it's the European Parliament. I think this is probably the main memory actor in the European arena. And they, of course, have to appeal to the European Commission for funding purposes. You all know that the European Commission doesn't have any legal leeway to influence national remembrance policies. But it has, since 2006, concentrated its efforts on funding projects, particularly grassroots projects that are running on the local and the national level. For example, the Europe for Citizens program. Now, with 26 million euros per year, it remains really one of the smaller funding programs, and it pales in comparison to some other programs that the European Commission is funding. But it has turned into one of the main tools in influencing transnational memory policies. I think it is fair to say that both within the Parliament and the Commission, the idea that the memories of colonialism and imperialism, and really the wide sense of the meaning, are no less European than the Holocaust, started to gain ground in the past 8 to 10 years. And what is interesting is, if you look at more closely when certain debates appeared, is that it seems as if the revolution of the what I called memory competition earlier between East and West, especially after the introduction of the 23rd of August as European-wide Remembrance Day for the victims of Stalinism and Nazism, that this resolution basically of this memory competition has lessened any pressure to question the Commission's further remembrance activities and has actually created the space for the concentration on other shared pasts. And you can see that before, especially in the European Parliament, discussions had concentrated a lot on the question of the equivalence, for example, of the memories of National Socialism and Stalinism, the equivalence of the experiences of the two totalitarian regimes. If this was really the main issue that was debated after the 23rd of August, which is the day when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed between Hitler and Stalin, when this was introduced as the second European-wide Remembrance Day next to the 27th of January, which is International Holocaust Day, that basically after that, suddenly debates started to change tone and started also to change focus. So then suddenly the whole question of like what other memories are there here that we might have to consider started to appear. Now, while there is a general realization of the importance of this history in all its facets, it seems to have albeit late but slowly entered public consciousness, the ambitions of the European Union at the level of symbolic politics really seem to stay behind concrete efforts to actively commemorate the crimes and atrocities committed during the colonial period. So you do not really see any real memory policies that have been developed, really. So a real paradigm shift can only be discerned at the level of intentions, as exemplified by the debates in the different policy forms, and less on the level of substantial policy initiatives, with the exceptions of what I mentioned before, funding opportunities. Now, the real interesting question is, of course, why is that the case? And this was really why I set out to do this research. And I think the answer can only be found if we look back at European integration history, really, and the very beginning of the relationship between what today is the European Union and its former colonies. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, European development policies have historically followed the priorities of single nation states, so the former colonial powers, directing their support towards the countries of their choice. And as a result, the European Union stayed out of most issues connected to the most painful, to the often painful process of decolonization. Now, the idea that the relationship with current or former colonies is a matter of exclusive national sovereignty seems to have also translated into the way the memory of colonialism is being dealt with. If the acknowledgement of responsibility for colonial crimes is insufficient at the national level, I don't think I have to give any examples here. We all know that on the national level, very little has been done when it comes to addressing this legacy. Then this amnesia is even more pronounced on the pan-European level. In terms of the prerequisites for symbolic as well as factual atonement, the European Union indeed has done very little in comparison to its reaction to the consequences of other wars and genocides in Europe. And this raises, of course, the question of how solid the foundations and the discourse and practice of normative power Europe are, on which the European Union can claim its own difference in international politics. The conscious neglection of the memory of colonialism potentially opens doors to the recreation, the consolidation, and the deepening of asymmetries and hierarchies produced by former colonial empires in their relationship with the global South. However, and I'd like to end on a more positive note here, if we look at the example of memory politics regarding Nazism and Stalinism, then we see how important the elaboration at the national level was before it could be addressed in a more comprehensive and a more encompassing way also at the European level. So maybe it's just a question of time. Thank you very much.